Hi everyone, I'm Nigel Gordyke, co-organiser of the Wilmot Terry Fox Run. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Leslie Scrivener, former reporter for the Toronto Star and author. Leslie covered the Marathon of Hope as it was happening, and she also wrote this book, Terry Fox, His Story. Thank you for joining me, Leslie.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet you, Nigel.
These days, many news stories come to the attention of journalists via social media. How did you become aware of Terry and the Marathon of Hope back in 1980? I mean, it wasn't that big a deal until after you were covering it.
I really do like this story because now, 40 years later, there's an element of nostalgia to it. So in those days, my editor, Bonnie Cornell, had lost her mother to cancer. And she saw on the CBC News that a young man was running across Canada. And she said, I was one of her reporters, and she said, find out if he's for real. Well, the first question was where to find him. He was somewhere in Newfoundland. So in those days, the Toronto Star had these amazing, amazing reporters. They were like hunters or like detectives, and they could find anyone, anywhere. They once found a reporter in a jail cell in Uganda. So they were just merciless. So maybe I got the assignment around noon, and by mid-afternoon, their cheerful voice came on the line. We have Mr. Terry Fox on the line for you. And they had called the RCMP, who had called around, and they found him at the home of the mayor of Come By Chance, Newfoundland. So that's the way we did our work, by phone. And you had to stay by your desk all the time in case someone called you back. And when we wrote the stories, we wrote them on ancient, maybe from the 1920s, Royal typewriters. I mean, really, where you had to really go bang, 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 not electric. And then Terry, after that first interview, and we hit it off. I mean, I was a believer, violating all the rules of journalism right from the start, because he was charismatic, and I think it was this energy and hope and optimism. And in no time, I was believing in him. And so he would call me once a week or more, from a phone booth or from somebody's house as he made his way across the country. Well, I guess across the Maritimes and then into Quebec and Ontario. So by today's standards, it was pretty, I guess it was simple. And then I was thinking about your question. How would Terry have responded to sort of citizen journalists? I mean, everywhere he went, there would be people with phones photographing and posting. And I wondered if his privacy would have been, if it would have been uncomfortable for him that his privacy would be so diminished, because everywhere people would have cameras and phones and be recording him, his every move. And as we know, this is a young man who just wanted to run. And having people around him was, of course, was a joy, but also a distraction from his purpose, which was getting to Vancouver.
It was after Terry saw what other cancer patients were enduring that he decided he needed to do something. But even though other people had already seen the same thing, no one else had attempted anything like the Marathon of Hope before. Where do you think Terry got his inspiration and his drive and his strength of character? Was it connected to his faith, perhaps?
He came, he had very strong family values. It was a very close, tight-knit family. They were very hardworking. I mean, even as a little kid, if the kids would go pick blueberries down in southern British Columbia, outside their home, to pay for their bicycles. So to begin with, he had a very, very strong work ethic. His mom always said he was average in everything but determination. So he had that drive. But the question is, when he was in the cancer hospital with those children, what is it that moved him to do something that no one else had done? What was there in his character that responded to that? I mean, maybe he was so frightened by what he saw, death. Maybe it was this young man's optimism. I'm an athlete. What can I do? Oh, here's a magazine. So, you know, his coach brought him the magazine of Runner's World magazine. And he thought, well, here's someone who has the same disability as I have. Then it was called worse than a disability then. He's running in the Boston Marathon. What can I do? So I can't answer your question directly, but that he saw an opportunity and he worked for it. And there was this element of inspiration. So, you know, you combine the two: inspiration, care for others, and hard work.
I mean, you talked about citizen journalism and people covering the Marathon of Hope. If it was happening now, you know, so it would be people with phones and everything videoing him and taking photos. How do you think the mainstream media would be covering it if it was happening now?
I think we would, you know, this isn't a great story to tell, but, you know, in news, it's usually news if it's bad news or really terrific news. But if it's just routine, reporters and editors are fickle. They want surprise and something that's new or hard or emotional or sad. And Terry's story was all those things, but after a while, it was just, you know, this charismatic young man running across Canada. So with the internet and online journalism, I could see that they might have a little section of their online presence saying Terry Fox today, and there would just be a picture and a few lines. The newspaper would probably still be so you know, short-staffed that it would be left to those little vignettes. And much as in my time, when there was some terrific story, then you'd be sent up. When Terry was with Greg Scott, the Star sent Christy Blatchford and captured the photographer captured those stunning images of them in the lake. And, you know, this poignant story of a man who had lost his leg, and a boy who had lost his leg, and a boy who was doomed. Because Greg died not long after. So I guess, and the CBC, of course, would just be as spectacular and reliable as the CBC is. I mean, I think the CBC would continue to have been a constant, quite devoted presence, recording this great story.
Well, I don't know if you follow Terry Fox Center on social media. I think it's a museum they're trying to set up out west. And this spring, that every single day they're posting an excerpt and a photo from Terry's journal. So it's almost like you're following it day by day. So I think social media, as it were, it would be maybe a substitute for a lot of what the mainstream media is doing. Yeah.
And that journal, by the way, I can't believe how fortunate I was that Terry's family let me have the actual book. I mean, that book is gold now. But I had that at home for the months that I was writing his book. And I probably just then didn't appreciate what a treasure it was. So that's very exciting that there's did you say it's a page a day?
Well, I think it's Daryl Fox who's doing it. He's posting an excerpt from the journal. I mean, so obviously as the run goes on and Terry has less time or it's to actually record stuff in his journal, perhaps it's going to be shorter passages. But for now, it's like maybe 3 or 4 sentences from the journal every single day on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So we're following him
sometimes
day by day.
He would have it was a ledger. It was a book this big, like a ledger really. Yeah. And some days it would be full. And you're quite right, toward the end, there would be a line that would say, this is so sad, nothing happened today.
Can you remember back in 1980, what else was happening in the news to capture Canadians' attention?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Nigel. I had to look, and I felt remiss that I didn't include that in a context. So lots of things happened. That was the year of the Iranian hostage crisis, when the Ambassador Ken Taylor worked with the CIA and sheltered American citizens who in Iran, and helped with their release. It was the year the Shah of Iran died. So this is the history of my era. These things were so vivid and alive. And I should tell you that in all those timelines about what happened in 1980 all over the world, Terry Fox's, the start of his run and the end of his run are always noted. So they have become of international significance. The Rubik's Cube was invented that year. What else? There was something, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back was released that year. Pierre Trudeau returned to government, returned as prime minister that year. What else? That's a few things.
Why do you think that Terry's legacy has lasted 40 years? What is it about him that's resonated with Canadians?
Well, first of all, he was one of us. You know, I think it's important that he was Canadian, and that, as his mom Betty said, he was ordinary. He was very easy to relate to. You know, he was a young boy, a young man who worked hard for everything he got in life. I mean, he loved basketball, but was perhaps less than adequate player as a boy, and he worked, as he said, his rear off to get on the team. And that year in grade 8, he played 1 minute. He had 1 minute of floor time, and by the time he got to university, he was on the junior varsity team. So we can relate to, you know, we can relate to not being successful. We can relate to, but I tried so hard. When I think of Terry too, I think of granite. I think of the granite of the Canadian Shield, where he ran, and where he was really tested. And I think that was in his core, that strength, that hardcore, with this sort of circle of compassion around him, and care for others. He was young. He was, you know, a very beautiful, healthy. He appeared to be such a healthy young man. And look at the pic. I'm looking at the photo behind you. He ran with the map of Canada on his chest. You know, I'm not. He made us want to try. Well, I'll speak for myself. To maybe try what you want to do a little harder. You know, not to give up. I mean, there are so many areas to relate to. Try, give your best. The other thing is that he said it feels good to give. That's a fantastic thing to say, and we need to hear that. So this combination of grit, compassion, this, you know, the fact that he wore the map of Canada. He was running also the hard way. You know, he was running from east to west. He was running into the wind. He didn't have the wind at his back. There's so many elements of his character that were revealed in the run. His you know, the way he'd get on a picnic bench in rural Nova Scotia and just tell his story simply and naturally. There was no artifice to him. I mean, he was a very, very beautiful person.
Do you have a personal favorite? Sorry, go ahead.
I'll add, and of course I didn't even mention cancer. Who among us has not known someone they loved who's been affected by cancer. So that, many people participate in the Marathon of Hope in Terry's name because they're running in memory of someone they love.
Sorry to interrupt you before. I was just going to ask you if you had a favorite personal memory from the Marathon of Hope.
Well, the story, I'm afraid I say this too often, but the one that I can actually see in my mind's eye as I'm speaking with you. Terry was staying in the Poplar Motel on the near the Ontario-Quebec border, and he gets up at 4 a.m, walks out of the motel. It's still dark. I think the CBC is there doing some filming. So then suddenly he's from the darkness into this bright light. He gets into the van and goes to the back and curls up in a blanket while Daryl, Doug and I are in the front and completely quiet. And then we drive to the place where they had set up a little cairn and a marker as a marker for that day's run. And then he gets out of the car again in silence and starts running. And it's again this quiet Ontario farmland, cows in the pasture, moon still high, and Terry running. It was just breathtaking. Okay, that's memory number one. Memory number two is at the Scarborough Civic Center, where the giant atrium there is crowded, full of people, and the base of it is full. And Terry gives this incredible emotional speech talking about, revealing the emotion that he felt in responding to all this great outpouring of feeling around him. And he says, if for some reason I don't get to finish this, it's up to you. It's up to you. So he was charging us. He was charging us to continue this run or to continue this marathon in his name. And after listening to him, his friend Doug said, I can't believe the person that Terry has become. Okay, third memory. He's in the hospital bed in I think it's called can't remember the name of the hospital. And he is returned home. He knows that cancer has returned. He's in the same hospital where he lost his leg, Royal Columbian Hospital. And he's lying in a rather large room, still wearing the clothing he wore in the Marathon of Hope. And his arms are crossed like this. And you can see this sort of, I cannot believe what has happened to me. Almost this refusal to accept this terrible diagnosis. And I think by wearing his uniform, he was saying to himself, I can and I will try to go back and finish this if I can.
Leslie, it's always a privilege to hear from people who knew Terry and actually spent time with him in 1980 during the Marathon of Hope, such an iconic Canadian event. Thank you so much for sharing your memories and thoughts with us.
Such a pleasure to talk about Terry and to talk with you, Nigel. Thank you for having me.